What if everything you were taught about American democracy was only half the story? What if the Founding Fathers didn't invent their system from scratch, but borrowed it from people they called savages? This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented history, buried in the letters of Benjamin Franklin, the records of the Albany Congress, and the official resolutions of the United States Senate. And it changes everything we think we know about the birth of America. In 2026, America celebrates 250 years since declaring independence. 2.5 centuries of democracy. Across the country, politicians will stand beneath the Capitol dome and deliver speeches about the brilliance of the Founding Fathers. They will talk about how a small group of enlightened men, in a single Philadelphia summer, created the greatest experiment in self-government the world had ever seen. But that story, as you are about to discover, is incomplete. The problem with that story is simple. The men who wrote the Constitution did not spend all their time in smoke-filled rooms in Philadelphia studying European philosophers. They spent years on the frontier. They negotiated treaties. They sat at council fires. And there, in the forests of what is now New York, they witnessed something that changed their understanding of how people could govern themselves. Something that European philosophy had never conceived of. Deep in the forests of upstate New York, a political system had been functioning perfectly for over 600 years before Columbus ever set sail. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, known to most Americans as the Iroquois, was the oldest living democracy on the face of the earth. While Europe was still in the Dark Ages, while kings and popes fought over who had the right to rule, the Iroquois had already solved the problem of how free people could govern themselves. Their constitution was called the Great Law of Peace. But unlike the U.S. Constitution, it was not written on parchment with ink. It was recorded on wampum belts, intricate strings of purple and white shell beads, each pattern encoding specific laws, each belt representing a chapter of their governing document. Trained readers could recite the entire Constitution from memory, simply by reading the patterns with their fingers. This system had preserved their laws for over 20 generations. The Great Law began with a figure known simply as the Peacemaker. Around the year 1142, nearly 300 years before Columbus, he traveled among 5 warring nations, the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca. Tribe after tribe, village after village, he convinced them to put down their weapons and unite. 5 separate nations, each with their own language and culture, agreed to become one confederacy under a single law. It was the first federal system in human history. The territory controlled by the Iroquois Confederacy stretched from the Hudson River in the east all the way to the Great Lakes in the west. It covered what is now New York State, parts of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and into Ontario, Canada. By the time European colonists arrived in significant numbers, the Confederacy had already been functioning for over 500 years. 5 centuries of continuous democratic government. That is older than most countries in the world today. When Dutch and English settlers arrived in the 17th century, they encountered something they had never seen in Europe. A political system where power was deliberately divided between different levels of government. Where leaders were chosen by the people, not by birth. Where women had a voice in political decisions. The settlers wrote home about it. They marveled at it. And eventually, one of the most brilliant minds in the colonies began to study it seriously. Benjamin Franklin was many things: printer, inventor, scientist, diplomat, publisher, postmaster. But one aspect of his life is rarely taught in schools. Franklin was deeply curious about Native American governance. He published some of the first detailed accounts of Iroquois political life in his newspaper. He attended treaty councils. And he came to believe that the Iroquois had built something that the divided British colonies desperately needed to learn from. Franklin devoured everything written about the Iroquois political system. He read Cadwallader Colden's book, The History of the 5 Indian Nations, one of the first detailed European accounts of the Confederacy's government. Colden described how the Iroquois Grand Council operated, how chiefs were selected by clan mothers, how decisions were made by consensus rather than force. Franklin was fascinated. He began to see that the Iroquois had solved problems that the colonies were still struggling with. In 1744, Franklin attended the Treaty Council of Lancaster, a major diplomatic meeting between colonial representatives and Iroquois leaders. These councils were formal affairs, conducted with elaborate ceremony involving wampum belts, speeches that went on for hours, and careful negotiation. Franklin watched it all. He saw how the Iroquois conducted diplomacy among themselves, each nation maintaining its independence while submitting to the greater good of the Confederacy. The parallel to the divided colonies was unmistakable. At the Lancaster Council, an Iroquois chief named Canassatego gave a speech that Franklin would remember for the rest of his life. Standing before the colonial delegates, Canassatego pointed out that the Iroquois nations had united under one law and lived in peace for centuries. Meanwhile, the British colonies were constantly feuding with each other, unable to agree on anything. His message was clear: if primitive people could unite, why couldn't civilized ones? It was a humiliating question. Our wise forefathers, Canassatego declared, established a union and amity between the 5 nations. This has made us formidable. It has given us great weight and authority with neighboring nations. We are a powerful confederacy. And if you follow the same plan, you will acquire the same power. He was practically handing them the blueprint for American unity. And Benjamin Franklin was listening. Franklin returned from Lancaster with his mind buzzing with ideas. He filled page after page with notes about Iroquois governance. The structure of their confederacy: separate states united under a central council, each retaining local control, with representation based not on population but on equal footing. This was the model he would spend the next decade trying to sell to his fellow colonists. A decade later, with war against France looming, delegates from 7 northern colonies gathered in Albany, New York. Their stated purpose was to coordinate defense against the French and their native allies. But Franklin had a larger agenda. He arrived with a plan that would transform the loose collection of colonies into something far more powerful, a united government modeled directly on the Iroquois Confederacy. Franklin's plan was written in a document called Short Hints Towards a Scheme for Uniting the Northern Colonies. It proposed a Grand Council, with representatives from each colony, and a President General appointed by the Crown. The similarities to the Iroquois Grand Council were intentional and unmistakable. A central government with power over defense, treaties, and trade. Individual colonies retaining authority over their internal affairs. It was the Iroquois model, adapted for Englishmen. The Iroquois delegation was present throughout the Albany Congress. They were not merely observers. They were active participants in a historic conversation about how separate peoples could unite without losing their individual identities. Iroquois leaders shared their understanding of federalism, the idea that power could be shared between local and central governments. This was a revolutionary concept in European political thought, but it was ancient wisdom to the Iroquois. After the Congress, Franklin wrote a letter to his printing partner, James Parker, that contains one of the most remarkable passages in American history. He wrote, "It would be a very strange thing if the 6 nations of ignorant savages should be capable of forming a scheme for such an union, and be able to execute it in such a manner as that it has subsisted ages and appears indissoluble, and yet that a like union should be impracticable for 10 or a dozen English colonies." Even his choice of the word savages was ironic. He was mocking his own people's prejudice. Franklin's Albany Plan of Union was ultimately rejected by the colonial assemblies. They were not ready to surrender any of their precious autonomy. The British Crown also rejected it, fearing that a unified colonial government would be too powerful and too difficult to control. But the seed had been planted. The idea of federalism, borrowed from the Iroquois, would not die. It would wait dormant for 30 years, until a revolution made it necessary. To promote the Albany Plan, Franklin created America's first political cartoon. It depicted a snake cut into 8 pieces, each segment labeled with the initials of a colony. Beneath it the words, "Join or die." The message was pure Iroquois philosophy, the bundle of arrows that cannot be broken when bound together, but snaps easily when separated. Franklin had taken an Iroquois metaphor and turned it into the rallying cry of American unity. 2 decades passed. Tensions between the colonies and Britain escalated into war, then into a revolution. As the fighting spread, the colonies realized that Franklin had been right all along. They could not defeat the most powerful empire on earth as 13 separate, squabbling entities. They needed to unite. And when the time came to design a government for their new nation, they turned, consciously or unconsciously, back to the Iroquois model. In the summer of 1787, 55 delegates gathered in the Pennsylvania State House, what we now call Independence Hall. Their task was nothing less than inventing a new form of government. And they were deeply divided. Large states wanted representation based on population. Small states demanded equal representation. The debate became so bitter that the convention nearly collapsed. It was the Iroquois problem: how to unite unequal partners under a single government. James Madison of Virginia argued passionately for proportional representation. William Paterson of New Jersey insisted each state must have equal votes. Gunning Bedford of Delaware threatened that the small states would seek foreign allies if they were not treated fairly. The convention was tearing itself apart. And then, a compromise emerged that bore an unmistakable resemblance to the Iroquois Confederacy, a two-chamber legislature that gave everyone something. The Great Compromise created a bicameral legislature. The House of Representatives, where seats were allocated according to population, giving large states the influence they wanted. And the Senate, where each state had 2 votes regardless of size, protecting the small states. This was exactly how the Iroquois Grand Council functioned. Each nation sent a number of chiefs proportional to its population, but each nation had 1 vote. Centralized power, balanced by local sovereignty. Federalism in action. To understand what the founders borrowed, you need to understand how the Iroquois Confederacy actually worked. The Grand Council was the central government. Each of the 5 nations sent chiefs to represent them. The number of chiefs varied by nation, but each nation had 1 collective vote. All decisions required unanimous consent. No nation could outvote another. And below the Grand Council, each nation managed its own internal affairs completely independently. It was federalism, perfected over centuries. The Grand Council met at Onondaga, the geographic and spiritual center of the Confederacy. The capital was deliberately located in the territory of the Onondaga Nation, who served as the keepers of the council fire. That fire was kept burning at all times, a sacred flame representing the continuing light of their democracy. When the council was not in session, the fire was covered with ashes, like embers waiting to be rekindled. A powerful symbol of democracy as a living, breathing thing. The Iroquois had invented the concept of federalism. Separate political entities, each with their own culture, language, and laws, voluntarily uniting under a central government for common purposes, while retaining their individual sovereignty. This was not a European idea. No European nation in the 1100s was organized this way. Europe was ruled by kings, emperors, and popes. The very notion that power could be divided and shared was an indigenous innovation that the founders adopted as the core principle of the United States. The Great Law of Peace divided governmental power into distinct branches. The Grand Council handled external relations and matters affecting the entire Confederacy. Each individual nation managed its own internal affairs, laws, land, community matters. And the clan mothers held a separate, independent power, the power to appoint and remove chiefs. This was not a separation of powers into executive, legislative, and judicial branches as in the American system. But it was a separation of powers nonetheless. Perhaps the most radical aspect of Iroquois democracy was the power of women. In Iroquois society, political authority was inherited through the female line. The clan mothers, senior women of each clan, held the power to select the chiefs who would represent their clan in the Grand Council. If a chief failed in his duties, the clan mothers could warn him 3 times. After that, they could remove him entirely. They called this process dehorning, stripping the chief of his authority, like removing the antlers of a stag. To understand how revolutionary this was, consider the status of women in Europe at the same time. In 1142, when the Iroquois were giving women the power to select and remove leaders, European women could not own property, could not vote, could not hold office, and were legally considered the property of their husbands. In France, women would not get the vote until 1944. In Switzerland, not until 1971. But in the forests of North America, women had held political power for 8 centuries. The U.S. Constitution includes a process for removing a president who has committed treason, bribery, or other high crimes, impeachment by the House, conviction by the Senate. The Iroquois had the same concept. A chief who abused his power, failed to represent his people, or violated the great law could be removed by the clan mothers. The process was formal, deliberate, and designed to protect the Confederacy from corrupt or incompetent leaders. The founders created an American version of the same safeguard. The United States Constitution established 3 branches of government: legislative, executive, judicial, each with checks and balances on the others. The Great Law of Peace had 3 interconnected levels too. The Grand Council, made up of the 50 chiefs. The clan mothers, with their power of appointment and removal. And the Pine Tree Chiefs, men who earned their position through merit and wisdom, rather than inheritance. Different design, same fundamental principle: no single person or group should have absolute power. John Rutledge of South Carolina, who would later become the 2nd Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, was one of the delegates most familiar with the Iroquois system. During the Constitutional Convention, he specifically argued for the separation of powers by pointing to the Iroquois Confederacy as proof that divided government could work. His argument helped convince skeptical delegates that the American system, like the Iroquois system, needed multiple centers of power. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay wrote the Federalist Papers to persuade the states to ratify the Constitution. In those essays, they argued for a federal system where the national government would be supreme in certain areas, while states retained authority in others. A system where the whole and the parts could coexist. This was exactly the balance the Iroquois had achieved. The Federalist Papers are taught as the pinnacle of American political thought. But their central idea, federalism, was indigenous. The influence of the Iroquois Confederacy is literally stamped onto the most important symbol of American power. The Great Seal of the United States depicts a bald eagle clutching a bundle of 13 arrows in one talon and an olive branch in the other. The eagle faces the olive branch, symbolizing a preference for peace. The bundle of arrows represents unity. Separate arrows can be broken, but together they are unbreakable. This symbol came directly from Iroquois tradition. In Iroquois tradition, an eagle sits atop the tree of peace, constantly watching for danger. The eagle's role is to warn the people of approaching threats, so that the Confederacy can prepare to defend itself. When Charles Thomson designed the Great Seal in 1782, he placed an eagle at the center, a vigilant guardian watching over the young nation. The eagle on the Great Seal and the eagle in Iroquois tradition serve the same symbolic purpose: vigilance in the defense of liberty. An Iroquois proverb says that a single arrow can be broken easily, but a bundle of arrows is unbreakable. This symbol, the bound arrows, appears on the Great Seal of the United States, the seal of the Senate, and even on the back of the U.S. dollar bill. The eagle holds 13 arrows, one for each of the original states, bound together as a symbol of their united strength. Benjamin Franklin understood this metaphor intimately. He had heard it from Iroquois chiefs at the treaty councils. When George Washington prepared his farewell address in 1796, he devoted much of it to warning against the dangers of factionalism and disunity. "The unity of government which constitutes you one people," he wrote, "is a main pillar in the edifice of your independence." He urged Americans to resist anyone who would seek to divide the nation. The language was different, but the message was identical to what Iroquois chiefs had been saying for centuries: unity is strength, division is death. Despite this profound and well-documented influence, the United States did not formally acknowledge the Iroquois contribution to its constitution for 200 years. The story of the Iroquois influence was buried, ignored, or dismissed as a coincidence. Generations of American schoolchildren learned about the Magna Carta, about John Locke, about Montesquieu and his theory of separation of powers. But they did not learn about the Iroquois Confederacy, the Peacemaker, or the Great Law of Peace. Why did it take 2 centuries for the United States to acknowledge what Benjamin Franklin himself had admitted in 1754? The answer is uncomfortable. Acknowledging that the Constitution was influenced by Native Americans would have contradicted the entire narrative of European cultural superiority that was used to justify westward expansion, the displacement of indigenous peoples, and the destruction of native cultures. It was easier to pretend that democracy was a purely European invention, brought to a savage land by civilized men. Finally, in 1987, on the 200th anniversary of the U.S. Constitution, the United States Senate passed a resolution that officially acknowledged the truth. Senate Concurrent Resolution 76 stated that the Constitution was influenced by the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. For the first time in American history, the federal government formally recognized that the world's oldest living democracy had helped shape the world's most powerful one. It was 200 years overdue. The resolution read, "The original framers of the Constitution, including most notably George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, are known to have greatly admired the concepts, principles, and governmental practices of the 6 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy." It went on to acknowledge that the Confederacy's system of federalism and separation of powers had contributed to the development of the Constitution of the United States. These were not vague words. This was an official government admission that American democracy has indigenous roots. The very next year, in 1988, Congress went even further. A new resolution called upon the President of the United States to formally recognize the contribution of the Iroquois Confederacy to the development of the Constitution. It urged that educational programs be developed to teach Americans about indigenous contributions to their democracy. The resolutions passed with bipartisan support. But outside the halls of Congress, few Americans ever heard about them. In 1987, the New York Times published an article titled, "Iroquois Constitution, a Forerunner to Colonists' Democratic Principles." For the millions of Americans who read it, it was the first time they had ever heard that their Constitution might not be entirely a European invention. The article traced the evidence from Franklin's letters to the Albany Plan to the final documents signed in Philadelphia. It was front-page news. And then, like so many important stories, it was slowly forgotten. In the decades since 1987, scholars from Harvard, Yale, Cornell, and dozens of other universities have published extensive research confirming the Iroquois influence on American government. Historians like Donald Grind, Bruce Johansen, and Elizabeth Tooker have traced the connections in meticulous detail. The evidence is overwhelming. The letters, the council records, the explicit references in the writings of the founders. Each new study adds another piece to the puzzle that the Senate finally acknowledged in 1987. Now, as America celebrates its 250th birthday, this story matters more than ever. It challenges us to see democracy not as a finished product handed down by a few brilliant men, but as a living, evolving human invention that many peoples have contributed to over many centuries. The Iroquois were not passive recipients of democracy. They were inventors of it. And the United States, at its founding, was their student. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy did not vanish. Today, over 90,000 Iroquois citizens live in communities across New York State, Wisconsin, Oklahoma, and Canada. Their reservation system includes some of the oldest continuously occupied indigenous settlements in North America. The Grand Council still meets at Onondaga, just as it has for 800 years. The council fire at Onondaga has never gone out. The oldest living democracy on earth is still very much alive. The clan mothers still choose the chiefs. The process has not changed in 8 centuries. When a chief dies or is removed, the clan mothers of his clan gather, deliberate, and select his successor. The Great Law is still recited from memory during council meetings. The wampum belts are still brought out and read. The Haudenosaunee are not a historical footnote, or a museum exhibit. They are a living, functioning democracy that predates the United States by more than 600 years. The central symbol of the Iroquois Confederacy is the Tree of Peace. According to tradition, the Peacemaker uprooted a great white pine tree and had the 5 nations bury their weapons in the hole beneath it. Then he replanted the tree on top, so that the weapons of war would never be seen again. At the top of the tree, he placed an eagle to watch for danger. The tree's white roots spread in the four directions, inviting all peoples who wanted peace to follow them to the shelter of the tree. There is a painful paradox at the heart of this story. The men who studied the Iroquois system, who praised it, who borrowed its structure for the Constitution, many of those same men also signed laws that displaced and dispossessed the very people who taught them. George Washington owned land that had been taken from indigenous peoples. Thomas Jefferson wrote about driving Native Americans across the Mississippi. The democracy that incorporated Iroquois ideas was the same democracy that destroyed Iroquois lands. In the decades after the Constitution was ratified, the United States government pursued a policy of Indian removal. Treaties were signed and broken. Land was taken by force. The Iroquois, who had been allies of the American cause during the Revolution, saw their territory shrink from millions of acres to small reservations. The same federal system that the founders had borrowed from the Iroquois was now used to justify their dispossession. This is the tragedy that shadows the entire story. Thomas Jefferson, who had also studied and admired the Iroquois system, wrote that Native Americans should be removed westward to make room for white settlement. "We shall drive them into the Stony Mountains," he wrote, referring to the Rockies. And then, he said, "we will leave them alone." The irony was lost on no one then, and should be lost on no one now. The same man who wrote that all men are created equal also signed removal treaties. Jefferson was a man of profound contradictions. So here is the paradox that every American must confront. The great law of peace and the United States Constitution are connected by a thread of influence that runs through Benjamin Franklin and the Albany Congress. One document borrowed from the other. The world's oldest democracy helped shape the world's most powerful one. And yet the people who created that older democracy were treated as obstacles to be removed, not as the political innovators they were. Today, Iroquois leaders are increasingly vocal about this forgotten history. They point out that their ancestors were not passive victims of colonization, they were active political thinkers whose ideas helped shape the modern world. They remind us that the Haudenosaunee Confederacy is not a primitive prelude to American democracy. It is a parallel political tradition, one that developed its own sophisticated system of governance centuries before Europeans arrived. Chief Oren Lyons, a faithkeeper of the Onondaga Nation and one of the most respected Iroquois leaders of our time, has said, "We are the original people of this land. Our democracy is the oldest on the continent, and it still functions today. The United States borrowed from us, and then forgot. Now it is time to remember." His words carry the weight of 8 centuries of unbroken democratic tradition. He speaks not as a victim, but as a teacher. Most American public schools still do not teach the Iroquois influence on the Constitution. Students learn about the Magna Carta, the English Bill of Rights, and the Enlightenment philosophers. They learn about Locke's social contract and Montesquieu's separation of powers. But they do not learn about the Great Law of Peace or the Confederate Council at Onondaga. An entire continent's contribution to political thought is reduced to a paragraph about wampum belts in a social studies textbook. But that is beginning to change. In New York State, where the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was born, legislation has been introduced to require that the Iroquois influence on the Constitution be taught in public schools. Similar efforts are underway in other states. Indigenous educators are creating curriculum materials. Museums are building exhibitions. The truth is slowly, finally, emerging from the shadows of historical neglect. On YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram, the story of the Iroquois Confederacy is reaching a new generation. Videos explaining the connection between the Great Law and the Constitution have been viewed millions of times. Indigenous creators are using modern platforms to share ancient knowledge. The history that was buried in academic journals and obscure books is now finding its way to the mainstream. Better late than never. The relationship between the Iroquois Confederacy and the United States was formalized by the Silver Covenant Chain, a treaty relationship dating back to the early 1600s. The chain was supposed to bind the two peoples together in peace, friendship, and mutual respect. It was to be polished regularly, meaning the treaty was to be renewed and reaffirmed by each generation. Like any chain, it was only as strong as its weakest link. Time and again, the United States broke that chain. Treaties were signed and then ignored or violated. Land was taken. Promises were broken. By some estimates, the United States signed over 370 treaties with Native American nations, and violated virtually every one of them. And yet, the Iroquois never stopped holding up their end of the bargain. They continued to send representatives to Washington. They continued to assert their sovereignty. They never gave up. Iroquois men fought for the United States in every major war, from the Revolution to the War of 1812, from the Civil War to both World Wars, from Korea to Vietnam to the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. They served in the Marines, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force. They were awarded medals for valor, including the Medal of Honor. They fought and died for a country that had taken their land and broken its promises. They did it anyway. Because this was their country too. During World War II, Iroquois soldiers served as code talkers, using their native languages to transmit military messages that the enemy could never decipher. The Germans and Japanese intercepted American communications, but they could not understand Mohawk, Oneida, or Seneca. These Iroquois warriors used the languages of their ancestors to help defeat fascism. They were fighting for democracy, the same democracy their ancestors had helped invent 6 centuries earlier. The flag of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy is as meaningful as any national flag. It features the Hiawatha belt design, purple symbols on a white background, representing the original 5 nations united around the central tree of peace. The belt has been a symbol of the Confederacy for centuries. It appears at powwows, at political gatherings, at United Nations conferences. It is the flag of the oldest continuously functioning democracy on the planet. The next time you look at a US dollar bill, look closely at the Great Seal. On the left side, the pyramid with the all-seeing eye. On the right side, the bald eagle. Count the arrows in the eagle's talon. 13. Bound together. Look at the olive branch. 13 leaves. The same symbolism that the Iroquois used for centuries. In 1782, when Charles Thomson designed the seal, he drew on the same visual language that the Iroquois had developed. The symbols of American unity were indigenous symbols first. The thread connecting the Iroquois Confederacy to the United States Constitution has never been broken. It runs through 8 centuries of history, from the Peacemaker planting the Tree of Peace, to Benjamin Franklin attending the Lancaster Council, to the Albany Plan, to the Constitutional Convention, to the Senate Resolution of 1987, to the 250th anniversary celebration in 2026. That thread is the unbroken story of democracy itself, a story that belongs to no single people and no single nation. So on this 250th anniversary of American independence, we must ask ourselves a difficult question. What does it truly mean to be a democracy? Is democracy a European invention, to be exported to the rest of the world? Or is it a universal human aspiration that has been invented and reinvented by many cultures, in many places, at many times? The Iroquois answer is clear. Democracy is not something that one people discovered and others learned. It is something that grows wherever people value freedom. Today, the Haudenosaunee are a living, breathing people. They are not a historical artifact. They are doctors, lawyers, teachers, artists, and activists. They speak their ancestral languages and practice their traditional ceremonies. They also use smartphones, drive cars, watch Netflix, and post on social media. They live in 2 worlds, the ancient world of the great law and the modern world of American society. And they have something to teach both worlds about what democracy really means. What does it mean to acknowledge that the United States Constitution was influenced by the Iroquois Confederacy? It means admitting that American democracy has an indigenous parent. It means rewriting the textbooks. It means that every July 4th, we should remember not just the founders in Philadelphia, but also the Peacemaker and the 50 chiefs who gathered at Onondaga. It means telling the whole story, not just the comfortable parts. The next time you hear a politician praise the wisdom of the Founding Fathers, remember this. The Founding Fathers were wise. But they were wise enough to learn from others. They studied the Iroquois system. They admired it. They borrowed from it. The men we revere as the architects of American democracy were themselves students of a democracy that was already ancient when they were born. Their genius was not in inventing something new, but in recognizing something that already worked. The challenge of 250 years is this: can America tell the complete story of its democracy? Can it honor the people whose ideas helped build it? The Iroquois are not asking for apologies. They are asking for acknowledgement. They are asking to be seen as what they are, not victims of history, but makers of it. The story of American democracy is incomplete without them. And a democracy that cannot tell its own true story is a democracy that does not fully understand itself. The Peacemaker envisioned a world where the 5 warring nations would live together as one family, under one mind and one heart. He believed that peace was possible, even between peoples who had been enemies for generations. He believed that the desire for peace was stronger than the desire for war, if only the right structure could be created. It was a radical vision in 1142. And on a planet still scarred by war in 2026, it remains a radical vision today. But it is a vision that has already worked for 800 years. If Benjamin Franklin could speak to us from the history books, he might remind us of his letter to James Parker. He might remind us that the Iroquois Confederacy had united 5 nations for so many centuries that it seemed indissoluble, and that the American experiment was built on the same principle. Franklin understood that the wisdom of democracy does not belong to any one race, any one religion, or any one continent. It belongs to everyone who is willing to learn from others. The evidence for all of this sits in the Library of Congress. Franklin's letters are there, in the manuscript collection. The Albany Plan of Union is there, with Franklin's handwritten notes. The records of the treaty councils are there, documenting the words of Iroquois chiefs. The 1987 Senate resolution is there. Any American can go and see these documents for themselves. The truth is not hidden in some secret archive. It is preserved in the most accessible library in the world, waiting for anyone who wants to find it. The Onondaga Nation continues to fight for its rights in American courts. They are pursuing land claims, seeking the return of territory that was taken from them in violation of treaties. They are not asking for special treatment. They are asking for what the law promises. They are asking for what the treaties say. They are asserting their sovereignty as a nation that predates the United States and has never surrendered its right to self-government. The Onondaga Council fire still burns. A new generation of Iroquois youth is learning the great law of peace in their schools, in their longhouses, and in their homes. They are memorizing the wampum belts. They are learning to recite the laws their ancestors have passed down for 800 years. They are being trained to take their place in the oldest continuous democracy in human history. And they are also learning about the United States Constitution, the document their ancestors helped inspire. These same young people use TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube to share their culture with the world. They post videos of traditional dances, of language lessons, of the ceremonies that have sustained their people for centuries. They are proof that ancient traditions and modern technology can coexist. The oldest democracy on Earth now has its own hashtags. The story of the Iroquois Confederacy is being told by a new generation of storytellers, using the most powerful communication tools ever invented. The full text of the Great Law of Peace has been translated into English and published online. Anyone with an internet connection can read it. And when you do read it, you will recognize principles that feel very familiar: representative government, checks and balances, separation of powers, federalism, impeachment, women's political participation. These are not European ideas that were brought to America. They are American ideas that were refined in America, by Americans, long before Columbus arrived. This July 4th, as fireworks explode over the National Mall in Washington, as bands play patriotic music, as politicians deliver speeches about the greatness of America, let there be a moment of silence. A moment to remember the people who were here first. A moment to acknowledge what was borrowed. A moment to honor the democracy that began not in Philadelphia, but in a forest clearing beneath a great white pine tree. The 250th anniversary belongs to all Americans. But it also belongs to the Iroquois. The truth is this: American democracy did not begin in Philadelphia in 1787. It began in a forest clearing, under a great white pine tree, when a peacemaker convinced 5 warring nations to unite. It was nurtured by generations of Iroquois chiefs and clan mothers who kept the council fire burning for 8 centuries. And when the Founding Fathers needed a model for their new nation, they looked to that fire, and they learned from its light. The democracy they buried in footnotes and forgotten textbooks never truly died. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy still exists. Its Grand Council still meets.